Hi, and welcome back to my channel. This is Quest for Faith, and I'm Brian. And today we are going to be talking about the big question, the authority of the church. And was Peter really the leader of the first century church? I don't know. Let's dive into it and let's figure it out together. All right, let's roll that intro. All right, so this is one of the biggest issues that Protestants that I had with the Catholic Church when I was first looking into this. And again, when I said at the end of the last video, do you go if it really is the real presence? And there's only two churches that say that, and that's the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church. And so this is something that I really had to wrestle with and deal with. And so talking about where I grew up in Church of Christ, and Church of Christ actually prides themselves on having no authoritarian structure whatsoever. So each church is individual. The congregation elects elders themselves. They govern what happens at the church level. There's no connection between the other churches, right? Back when Church of Christ started, that was a fairly new concept in the 1800s, 1830s. But today, with most non-denominational churches, that's not that big of a deal. Typically, it's the preacher that started the church is the one that makes most of the decisions. So you can kind of see how Christianity, especially in America, has pulled away from that structure of having a church hierarchy of authority. And so I always was taught that authority was a bad thing when it came to church. But then a question starts bugging me. If there's no leader of the church, there's no one to tell me if my ideas are right or wrong. Do we all become our own pope? I think we kind of do. And I think some of us are okay with that because it's my way or the highway. Is what a lot of churches do, which is why we have 4,000 different 40,000 different denominations in today's world. So looking into this, I wanted to really see, is there anything biblical that would help me with this question, right? Because if there is no real church authority, there is no real need for a pope, then it's Orthodox. If I find that there is a need for a pope, then it's the Catholic Church. Those are my two options if the Eucharist is a real thing. And I fully believe it is. So where we look first? Obviously, most verses people talk about is Matthew 16:13 through 20. So let's go ahead and dive over there and take a look at it. So this is an interesting passage, and I'm going to break this down in several different ways. And hopefully it'll shed some light onto this passage. So starting off in verse 16, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, "Who do my people say the Son of Man is?" And so the first thing I want to point out here is, why did Matthew feel like we needed to know that he went to Caesarea Philippi? I have no idea what's in Caesarea Philippi, but guess what? Everybody in the first century church that would have read Matthew's letter knows exactly what's in Caesarea Philippi. So let's do this. Let's just copy, paste, and oh, here we go. Let's just look at a few images here. What is Caesarea Philippi? Well, back then, Caesarea Philippi probably looks something like this or like this. Obviously, these are renderings of what people think it looked like. And in Caesarea Philippi, there was this temple here. There was two temples. One was to the god Pan, who's the god over the sheep and goats. And they would have ritualistic orgies here on site. There was also one of these temples was also one for Caesar, I believe. And so you have a man that died that there's a temple for them now, right? So, and the other thing that's interesting is right behind this building, and we're going to look at a newer picture of it. This is what it looks like today. There is this gigantic hole. And what was in that hole was, it was so deep during the first century and during the Jesus's time that they could never find the bottom of it. And so all the pagans thought that this was a gate to Hades. This is how we get to the underworld. And what they would do is they would come in and they would walk through this temple, throw a sacrifice in the hole, and then they'd run out. Let's see if I can get a picture of it. Here we go. They'd run out to go look in the Jordan River. This is the mouth of the Jordan. And to see if their sacrifice floated by, if there was any blood. And if there was no blood or no evidence that it was thrown in there, the gods have accepted my sacrifice. If there was, they've rejected it. So this is why Caesarea Philippi is big for this verse, okay? So let's keep reading here. Continuing on 14. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Then Jesus asked them, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" And then Simon Peter steps up to bat again, first in line, says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now think of that statement, the Son of the living God. They have a temple to a dead God, a dead Caesar behind them. You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Whew. And Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Petros, Peter, and on this Petra rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Can you imagine? They're standing here in Caesarea Philippi. How much you want to bet when Jesus said that, he turned around and pointed in the direction of where these temples were? This is Jesus being a great teacher. They walked all the way up to Caesarea Philippi, which is on the northern border of today's Israel, bordering Lebanon, to make this point. And then he goes on and says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So what does that mean? What would it mean to 12 fishermen, Jewish fishermen in the first century, to hear Jesus say he's going to give them the keys of the kingdom of heaven, to give Peter? He's singling out, because you got to remember, all the apostles are standing here. This is not just Peter. This is all of them. And he says, "You, Peter, I'm going to give you the keys." So what does that mean? What is he talking about there? And also I want to point out here that to bound in heaven, or what you will bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Those are common legal terms that were used during that time, that the Pharisees would bound and loose things. So that was normal language, and that wasn't unusual language, but that was language of an authoritarian type position, right? You had authority to bound and you have authority to loose things. But we're going to do something fun here. We're just going to search keys. Or key. Let's just search that. What does it come? Oh, look at that first verse that pops up. Isaiah 22. "I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." Does that sound kind of familiar? It really does, doesn't it? What you bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. What was Jesus talking about with the keys? What is this? Why is this in Isaiah? Well, in this passage in Isaiah, it's talking about the chief steward of the kingdom of Israel. And what the chief steward was, he was second in command to the king, and he was giving keys. Literal, a gigantic described as a 2x4 type key. That he would walk around Jerusalem with his key to unlock the gates in the morning, get the treasury open, run the kingdom in the king's absence. And I think reading both of these verses and reading all of Isaiah 22, you see that the chief steward, the highest position in the courts, is a position that is passed on. And so if I'm a first century Jewish fisherman and I hear Jesus say he's going to give Peter, Simon, who is called Peter, the keys to the kingdom of heaven, I'm thinking this. This is what's going on in my head, right? So let's go back. So I'm reading this and I'm seeing the correlation between the old kingdom of Israel, and you look at the whole idea of when the angel comes to Mary and she says that you will have a son and he will be called Jesus and he will sit on the throne of David, right? The building the kingdom of heaven. This is a key, no pun intended, position for the kingdom of heaven. And it definitely looks like Peter is labeled out to be the kingdom of the chief steward of the kingdom of heaven. And that position doesn't end when the chief steward dies. It gets passed on to somebody else. That's how it worked in Israel. Why would they keep making so many different references in the Gospels about restoring the kingdom? Because that's how it functioned. It's how the church functions today. But for this to be true, I got two things on this. For this to be true, what do we say about everyone that's the common misconception, I think misconception, of most Protestants that, you know what, the church completely fell away after like 3rd or 4th century, and it was just the Catholic Church ruined Christianity, and there was really no real Christianity being practiced until after the Reformation. To me, that sounds like Jesus is lying here, that the gates of Hades did overcome the church. I know people will make that argument and they'll say, well, there was pockets of people that were in isolation that were worshiping God correctly. But that doesn't make sense with this passage. It falls flat on its face. But for this to be true, we have to see different examples of Peter leading. And we see that. We see that in Acts on the day of Pentecost, when guess who's the one that preaches to everybody on the day of Pentecost to be repent and be baptized when they're in Jerusalem. We see this on the Council of Jerusalem when Peter stands up and says, yeah, the Gentiles do not have to follow the old customs. So we see that leadership in Peter. But do we see that leadership carry on after Peter? That's the key thing we need to look at. So I touched on this on my last video, but we do, and fairly quickly. We have a situation, and I'm going to go over it again, and it's definitely in the last video, and I'll do a link here at the end for that video if you want to watch it on the first century church. But we have a situation in Corinth again, right? It's crazy that they had 2 letters from Paul and they still can't get it right, and they're still within 60 years of Jesus dying. So there's still issues in Corinth, and this is supposedly in the 90 AD, 96 AD, somewhere in there. And you had at the time the 3rd successor to Peter is Clement. And I want to remind everybody at this time, John, the Apostle John, the one whom Jesus loved, the one who took care of Mary after Jesus died on the cross, was still alive and only about 600 miles away from Corinth. But the church in Corinth didn't write to John to ask them what to do about the issues they were having. They wrote to Rome. They wrote to someone's 1,000 miles away. And you got to remember, this is ancient times. This isn't where, oh, well, it'll get there in 2 or 3 days. Why wouldn't you write to John? Just write to him. That's easy. But they wrote to Rome. And Clement writes back and speaks in a very authoritative manner. You can read his letter to the Corinthians. We still have copies of it today. And he speaks in an authoritative manner. And you know what happens when because essentially what happened is the young and the old people were having this fight within the church in Corinth. And some people kicked other people out of the church, and there was separating, and Clement writes back and says, you can't do that. You need to be one, unity within Christ. And they listened to him. Which is fascinating, because if that dude in Rome, the bishop in Rome at the time, Clement, wasn't important, why did they write to him about this issue? And then, furthermore, why did they say, you know what, you're right, we're going to listen to you? Because the only way that makes sense that they listen to him really is if he was considered the head of the church. This is 96 AD, right? Because if you look at it in a Protestant way, you know what? There would just be Christ Fellowship Church 506 non-denominational. It's going to be down the road from the Catholic Church in Corinth, right? I mean, that's how it would happen today. There wouldn't be some other person in a completely different city that would write and everybody there would listen and join back together. That wouldn't happen today. The church would split and there'd be another new non-denominational church in town. That's how it would work today. But they didn't. They listened. And then I find other evidence of this with one of the letters. I talked about Ignatius of Antioch in the last video too. And one of those letters that he wrote to the Pope. And I can't remember who was the Pope in 106 AD. Or the Bishop of Rome. But it's interesting reading it and how he addresses him. As if he is stationed higher than him. And he's the Bishop of Antioch. So you see this played out in the 1st century. You see it played out in the 2nd century. And so on and so forth until the Reformation in the 1500s. Really, okay, the schism with the Orthodox in 1000. I forget what date that was. But from my research, from reading the scriptures, it completely looks like Peter was the head of the church. He was the chief steward of the kingdom of heaven. And the chief steward of the kingdom of heaven, that position is always there and gets passed down. And that it does seem that Jesus was building a physical church, not an invisible church, which I grew up believing. So honestly, this was not a great day for me when I was reading this and I was trying to argue the other way with zero evidence. I was looking up as many Protestant sources as I could, trying my hardest, because the last thing I wanted to do was become Catholic. I did not want to make that leap. But now I know the Eucharist, there is the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. Now I know that Peter was the head of the church, and the chair of Peter still sits today in Rome. And what does that mean for me today with Pope Francis? Because there's a lot of things that Pope says that I do not like. Just don't all Catholics automatically just bow down and worship the Pope, and anything he says is infallible and he's never wrong? Right? That was my impression. Why are you listening to this tyrant in Rome? You're in America. Do your own thing. Until I started looking up papal infallibility. So the church has been around for over 2,000 years. There's been over 200 popes. How many times has a pope used papal infallibility? 10 times? 100 times? 200 times? We're talking 2,000 years with over 200 different popes. Should be a lot, right? Because anything the Pope says is infallible, right? Well, it turns out there's a really narrow thing that can happen for papal infallibility. And it's only been used twice in the history of the Catholic Church for a pope to speak infallibly. 2 times. Hasn't happened in almost 500 years now. I think. I'd have to double check on that. Now, councils have met and been considered infallible. But so it seems that there is this reverence for the papal infallibility, and that it's not used all the time. And you see there's arguments back and forth with the Pope and with clergymen and laymen about what's going on, and it's okay to question the Pope, which blew my mind. I didn't know that. And it turns out that the Pope can't go against the teachings of the church in an infallible statement. The longer and longer the popes are around, the further down they go, they have less leeway to speak infallibly because they can't contradict anything that the church doctrine actually teaches. What? So reading that, it made me feel a little bit more comfortable with this. I was surprised, but I felt better. So maybe I can make this Catholic thing work, but I still have way too many questions. So what did I do next? So next I started doing my research into it and going, I don't know about this. I don't know about this Mary thing and praying to the saints. So that's what the next video is going to be about. It's going to be, what do Catholics mean when they pray to Mary? What are they doing this Hail Mary thing for? What do you mean you pray to saints? What's actually going on there? So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you learned something new. Please like, share, and subscribe. Share it with your friends and family. I hope y'all are having a great day, and I'll talk to you guys later.